Hi, Simon and Elliot. It's your mom. This story that I'm going to be reading for you today is called The Flopsy Bunnies. It's actually the last story in our Peter Rabbit storybook. It is said that the effect of eating too much lettuce is sporific. No, sorry, that wasn't right. That the effect of eating too much lettuce is soporific. I have never felt sleepy after eating lettuces, but then I am not a rabbit. I've never heard of that word before. It's soporific. Soporific. I'm gonna have to look that up. They certainly had a very soporific effect upon the Flopsy bunnies. When Benjamin Bunny grew up, he married his cousin Flopsy. They had a large family, and they were very improvident and cheerful. I do not remember the separate names of their children. They were generally called the Flopsy bunnies. As there was not always quite enough to eat, Benjamin used to borrow cabbages from Flopsy's brother, Peter Rabbit, who kept a nursery garden. Sometimes Peter Rabbit had no cabbages to spare. When this happened, the Flopsy bunnies went across the field to a rubbish heap in the ditch outside Mr. McGregor's garden. Mr. McGregor's rubbish heap was a mixture. There were jam pots, and paper bags, and mountains of chopped grass from the mowing machine, which always tasted oily, and some rotten vegetable marrows, and an old booster too. One day, oh joy, there was a quantity of overgrown lettuces, which had shot into flower. So they talk about Mr. McGregor's rubbish heap. Rubbish is another word for garbage. But it seems like it sounds more like a compost pile, right? Because there were grass clippings and old lettuces and all of that. So it's interesting that they call it a rubbish heap, but we call it probably a compost pile here. The Flopsy bunnies simply stuffed lettuces. By degrees, one after the other, they were overcome with slumber and lay down in the mown grass. Benjamin was not so much overcome as his children. Before going to sleep, he was sufficiently wide awake to put a paper bag over his head to keep off the flies. The little Flopsy bunnies were delightfully in the warm sun. They slept. From the lawn beyond the garden came the distinct clackety sound of the mowing machine. The blue bottles buzzed about the wall, and a little old mouse picked over the rubbish among the jam pots. So it looks like this is the rubbish pile, or the garbage or compost pile back here. And it looks like Benjamin, they started to fall asleep. So that gives me an idea of what that word meant on the first page, right? Soporific or soporific probably means something with overcome with slumber or sleepy. But I'll look it up after I finish this video, and then we could talk about it later today. So you see all the bunnies picking over in the rubbish pile, and they all slept. They were sleeping in the sun, right? But they did hear the sound of a mowing machine, which I think is what a lawnmower would be for us. And so maybe that's a little foreshadowing. Maybe, right? And if we remember what foreshadowing means, it means that it's kind of like a clue that something's going to happen. Maybe not so good. I can tell you her name. She was called Thomasina. Thomasina Tittlemouse, a wood mouse with a long tail. She rustled across the paper bag and awakened Benjamin Bunny. The mouse apologized profusely and said that she knew Peter Rabbit. While she and Benjamin were talking, close under the wall, they heard a heavy tread above their heads, and suddenly Mr. McGregor emptied out a sack full of lawn mowings right upon the top of the sleeping Flopsy bunnies. Benjamin shrank down under his paper bag. The mouse hid in a jam pot. The little rabbits smiled sweetly in their sleep under the shower of grass. They did not awake because the lettuces had been so soporific. They dreamt that their mother, Flopsy, was tucking them in a hay bed. Mr. McGregor looked down after emptying his sack. He saw some funny little brown tips of ears sticking up through the lawn mowings. He stared at them for some time. Presently, a fly settled down on one of them and it moved. Mr. McGregor climbed down on the rubbish heap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said he as he dropped them into his sack. The Flopsy bunnies dreamt that their mother was turning them over in bed. They stirred a little in their sleep, but still they did not wake up. Mr. McGregor tied up the sack and left it on the wall. He went to put away the mowing machine. Yikes, so just as we predicted, that the sound of the lawnmower was foreshadowing, well, now we know, right, that the little rabbits that were sleeping on the rubbish or the compost pile, Mr. McGregor saw when he was dumping the grass clippings back there. So Benjamin Bunny was talking to a little mouse a little further away from this pile, and they saw Mr. McGregor pick up all the little bunnies and put them in his sack. Oh no! What do you think Mr. McGregor's gonna do with the bunnies? What do you think's gonna happen? Make a prediction. Okay, let's see what's gonna happen. While he was gone, Mrs. Flopsy Bunny, who had remained at home, came across the field. She looked suspiciously at the sack and wondered where everybody was. Then the mouse came out of her jam pot, and Benjamin took the paper bag off his head, and they told the doleful tale. Benjamin and Flopsy were in despair. They could not undo the string. But Mrs. Tittlemouse was a resourceful person. She nibbled a hole in the bottom corner of the sack. The little rabbits were pulled out and pinched to wake them. Their parents stuffed the empty sack with 3 rotten vegetable marrows, an old blacking brush, and 2 decayed turnips. Then they all hid under a bush and watched for Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor came back and picked up the sack and carried it off. He carried it hanging down as if it were rather heavy. The Flopsy bunnies followed at a safe distance. They watched him go into his house, and they crept up to the window to listen. Mr. McGregor threw down the sack on the stone floor in a way that would have been extremely painful to the Flopsy bunnies if they had happened to have been inside. They could hear him drag his chair on the flags and chuckle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said Mr. McGregor. Eh? What's that? What have they been spoiling now? Inquired Mrs. McGregor. So that's the 2 rabbit parents really sad that their children are in that sack that Mr. McGregor put them in. And the little mouse telling them that she had an idea. And that's all the bunnies that escaped. I wonder how Mr. McGregor is going to react when he learns that the rabbits escaped. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little fat rabbits, repeated Mr. McGregor, counting on his fingers. 1, 2, 3. Don't you be silly. What do you mean, you silly old man? In the sack. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, replied Mr. McGregor. The youngest Flopsy bunny got upon the windowsill. Mrs. McGregor took hold of the sack and felt it. She said she could feel 6, but they must be old rabbits because they were so hard in all different shapes. Not fit to eat, but the skins will do fine to line my old cloak. "Mind your cloak," shouted Mr. McGregor. "I shall sell them and buy myself something. Rabbit tobacco? I shall skin them and cut off their heads." Mrs. McGregor untied the sack and put her hand inside. When she felt the vegetables, she became very, very angry. She said that Mr. McGregor had done it on purpose. And Mr. McGregor was very angry too. One of the rotten marrows came flying through the kitchen window and hit the youngest Flopsy bunny. It was rather hurt. Oh. That's them following Mr. McGregor back home, with Mr. McGregor thinking they're in the sack. And that's when he threw things out the window and they actually hit the bunnies, when he was angry that he found out the bunnies had escaped. Then Benjamin and Flopsy thought it was time to go home. So Mr. McGregor did not get his tobacco, and Mrs. McGregor did not get her rabbit skins. The next Christmas, Thomasina Tittlemouse got a present of enough rabbit wool to make herself a cloak and a hood and a handsome muff and a pair of warm mittens. So this is the mouse that saved the little rabbits' lives, and the bunny family sent the mouse wool so she could make her own outfits. That was nice, as a thank you gift. So, based on this story, let's go back to that word. Soporific or soporific. The way that they use it, they say the effect of eating too much lettuce is soporific or soporific. And based on the story, I was able to guess that it meant really sleepy, that you get really sleepy. So I was able to use the story to help me find out what that word meant, even though it's a new word and I've never heard it before. Also, I think it's interesting that we see composting in this story. This is a story from probably not quite, but almost 100 years ago, I have to guess. So it's cool to see that they were using composting. Let's see where it was from. Oh no, I thought it was a lot older than it is. Looks like this was copyrighted in 1986. So I thought it was early 1900s that these were written. So it's not 100 years old. More like, what, 85, that's 20, it's like 40 years ago. But yeah, people composted then. Anyway, I would like you to, I think that I really like hearing about you guys playing games and playing with one another. So maybe you could, today, make your own compost pile, either outside or inside, depending on the weather. And you can play Mr. McGregor and those rabbits. And you could try to catch each other in the compost pile or in the pile of leaves. I know that if it's nice out, you're probably going to be raking the leaves and working outside, maybe, with Daddy. But I want you to know that I'm thinking about you, and I'll see you when I get home. I love you guys.